Yo, what's going on, golf fans? It's your boy, Gsluke, here with our DFS and prop stream for the Farmers Insurance Open. Going to get you ready for all of your exposure this week. But first off, a look at the weather report, also some DFS strategy heading into lock tomorrow. We'll talk through the underdog and prize picks boards, course conditions for Thursday, as well as some matchup bets on the sports books too. But anything on top of that you're curious about, feel free to go ahead and hit me up in the live chat. That could be about strategy for DFS, any player deep dives that you're curious about, course fit, all of that a little bit later on. But welcome on in to everyone we have in the chat already. We got Jeff over there making a live chat for once. We'll go over your question just a little bit later on. We got Soda Kid in the chat. He says, make sure you all hit the like button. Amen to that, doing my job for me. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and do so. We got Nathan in the chat, also rushing yard as well. He says that it's Marco Penge week, and I tend to agree with you on that one. We got Michael Dolan in the chat as well. Hopefully you guys are having a fantastic week, and I tend to agree with you on that when you said you're looking at a Tom Kim over and a Taylor Pendrith under. We're going to go through props and bets towards the second half of this. So if you're here for underdog and prize picks, stay tuned for that a little bit later on. But I do like the Tom Kim fade out of those two, but more on that later. We have another question that we'll go through as well. Jay Bonzo, the football nerd in the chat. Hopefully you guys are having a good one, but we're going to keep this one a little bit quicker. 40 minutes is our time cap here, as I've got to get to the butcher to pick up a couple bone-in ribeyes. So I'm cooking out. We're splurging a little bit after our really good start to the year. We're already up about 12 units into the profit on the prop and the betting side of things. So the lines makers are paying for our bone-in ribeyes tonight. And I know the butcher, I'm really good buddies with them. They closed at 7, but he said he would stay there until 8 for me tonight. So I'm going to get out of here at about 7:40 Eastern time. But until then, let's talk some golf. So first and foremost, we got this golf course at hand, which I should say golf course is, because we do have a 2-course setup. But the South course, the one that is way harder out of the two, is a true big boy golf course. And I really like that change compared to the first couple events of the year, which were much easier from the scoring end of the spectrum. This is going to be a +1 to even a +2 scoring average at times. So I'm looking forward to that kind of a change this week. But in terms of what we're looking for in players, it also changes the kind of skill set of what's going to play well, rather than looking for high birdie or better percentage players that are putting first, especially on that POA overseed the last couple weeks. We're more so looking for ball strikers, guys that can hit the ball a long way off the tee because of how long the South course is in bogey avoidance, as opposed to looking at birdie or better stats. So first and foremost, if you haven't seen any content this week, just make sure you're adjusting that sort of end of your modeling, because it's not like the last few golf courses, and some of your recent form as well, if you're looking at the last couple events to start this year, could be misleading in some cases, because guys that were playing well at Birdie Fest aren't necessarily always going to do so at the harder golf courses too. And from the weather perspective, it does look like a perfect week in San Diego, which was not the case the last few times we played this event. You had last year, which was horrendous conditions for 2 of the 4 rounds. Even the year before that, you had the wind kicking up at certain points. But Thursday, this is the HRRR that we're looking at right now, only has it getting close to 10 miles an hour for about 1 hour tomorrow. The rest of the day, you're talking about sub 6 miles an hour sustained. So the best scoring conditions that you're going to see for La Jolla. Then we take a look at Friday. I'm going to change this to the GFS, which will be a little bit better for more than 24 hours out. Also in the afternoon, it does kick up to close to 8 to 9 miles an hour, but doesn't creep over 10 miles an hour at any point. And your wind gusts are pretty much non-existent as well. So whether you're playing the harder course on Thursday or the harder course on Friday, it looks like you're going to get a pretty similar set of conditions. So to go to the DFS strategy, it doesn't look like the weather is really going to impact all that much for main slate. But for showdown purposes, you only want guys that are playing the easier North course. And we don't have the stat averages on here, but I do have them over here towards the right. The South course last year, this was a harder year compared to most at this event. The harder course played plus 1.67. The other golf course was nearly an entire stroke easier at just plus 0.72. But if you take a look at years prior to that, it's an even bigger difference than this nearly stroke difference that you had last year. In fact, most years, it's closer to a 2.5 to a 3 stroke difference from golf course to golf course. So while for main slate, I don't see a massive edge for rounds 1 and 2. If you're 150 max player, I guess you could take 5 to 10% of your lineups and stack them like 5-1 or 6-0 in either direction cushion just in case. But I think that's honestly getting a little bit too cute on a week like this because the weather doesn't look like it's that much of a factor. But for showdown purposes in rounds 1 through 2, you absolutely should be playing the North Course guys. So I think that's more so where it's something that you really have to keep an eye on. But at least as of current weather forecasts, doesn't look like that aspect is going to be all that impactful. Let's go to ownership next. That's going to be our next go-to when it goes to breaking down one of these slates. I will catch up on a few of the questions that we already had in the chat, but after we go through a few of the initial questions, we're going to break down the ownership from 8K plus, because without a massive weather edge and without a massive course edge on a week like this, the biggest possible EV that you can squeeze out on a slate like this is going to be with the game theory angle and taking a stance against the rest of the field. Golf is one of the more unpredictable sports that we have of the major ones for DFS. So knowing that and accounting for that is, like I said, the biggest presented edge that we have for this sort of a format. So more on that in a second, but let's catch up on a few of those early questions that I saw there before. By the way, any player deep dives, now is the time for that. On this spreadsheet, by the way, this is from my Patreon page of what we're looking at right here. We can go through recent form. That would be during the fall swing and some of these early events in 2026. You got event history at the Farmers. Also the last 24 and last 12 measured rounds for shots gained metrics to completely go through any players that you're curious about. That can be for DFS, course fit, whatever you guys want to know. Just feel free to go ahead and let me know. But we did have a question regarding a couple of the guys that were kind of sick last week, guys like a Ludwig and a Rico Hoey. I don't have any insider information on that. I know the same that everyone else does, is that they were sick last week. They weren't able to go over the weekend, but they're all teeing it up this week. Doesn't seem like any of them had said anything in their interviews. So I'm assuming that they're 100%. It was, I would say, more than likely a quick bug that a lot of those players got. Could a few of them have some residual effects? I would say that is possible, but I do think the ownership, at least if you're looking at it from the fantasy standpoint here, might actually be advantageous that they have that happen last week, because a lot of people aren't going to use them because of that news. Maybe they think that it's an injury that caused them to withdraw, whereas it's something where it's a lot more feasible for them to bounce back in just a single week. So I actually like those two players, especially with their course fit this week, and no actual information on it, but I think it could be a positive depending on how you're looking at that sort of thing. We had a few prop questions. We'll save those for that section of this. What do I think about going all in on bombers for the North Course and Showdown? So yeah, you need all North Course guys. That is for sure. There's no question about that. The all in on bombers, I don't know if that has to be something that you go behind, but if you want that to be a round one narrative, then I think that's totally fine. But yeah, North Course guys is really the one priority that you have to have in your process for that. I would say the North Course, though, just to kind of go through the bomber thing or not, it's not as long as the South Course. So the reason why you play bombers at this track is for the other 3 rounds at the longer, harder golf course. The North Course, we've seen guys like Snedeker, Zach Johnson. We've seen Justin Rose when he won this event. He shot like nearly 59, I think. At the North Course, you don't have to be a bomber to shoot a low one around there. So I don't think that's like a terrible narrative to lean into, but that is a better narrative for the South Course, I would say. What's going on, Steven? Welcome on in. What about Day? You're itching to play him this weekend. I wouldn't talk you off. He's got fantastic course history. Just to look at some of the Jason Day stuff, that's kind of the most notable thing on him, is that he's got that 7th place in 2023 and a 3rd place in 2022. Hits the ball high. He likes the rough here. He's from Australia. They have Kikuyu grass in Australia as well as South Africa. A lot of South Africans and Australians have found a lot of success at this style of golf course. So yeah, if you're thinking about playing a J Day, then I think that's totally fine. He's somebody that's rating out as a 7.5 and 8 out of 10 course fit. He's got great form with that runner-up finish from last week. So yeah, not too many complaints from me, and no pushback for sure. Can I deep dive Smotherman and Ford? We for sure can. So Smotherman last week had by far the best week that you're going to see from him. So we'll look at the last 12 measured rounds. Last 24 are from like years ago, because he has not played much on the PGA Tour. Even this last 12 round sample size is like from the one event recently and then events from like a year ago. But look at this. 1.7 shots gained approach per round. That is just nutty stuff. Gaining off the tee and then losing with the short game. This is exactly what you'd expect from Smotherman. He's a striper that really struggles on and around the green. And this is a golf course that he could really play well at. And from what I've heard, somebody that used to caddy for Smotherman, I'm relatively close with, said that he loves POA. He loves this time of the year. And you play Smotherman when he's streaky and when he's hitting the ball well. And I would say this 1.7 shots gained at approach qualifies as him hitting the ball well. So that's the first deep dive. And then the other one was David Ford, I believe, if memory serves me correctly. I'll double check in a second, but I think I'm right there. Doing it in a very similar fashion, gaining off the tee, gaining on approach, and then losing in the 2 short game categories. So yeah, if we're looking for ball strikers, guys with a high floor, this is a golf course that's right up these 2 players' alley. So yeah, I would say a 9 out of 10 on a Smotherman, probably an 8.5 out of 10 on a David Ford. The only thing on Ford, and this is me really trying to nitpick it, is that I hate to say this, is that he's got the Brian Harmon syndrome going. He's not only a lefty, but he's also short, and he doesn't hit the ball that long. That's the only thing that I would say is I wish he hit the ball a little bit longer. He was closer to the bomber that we had on the Smotherman side. But David Ford is truly coming into his own. He played well during some of those fall swing events, but is now starting to do it in 2026 as well. So he was the #1 on the college tour last year. So not really a surprise that David Ford is having that kind of success. But maybe that he's finding this much success so quickly in his career is the only thing that's a little surprising there. But I like how both set up, and in particular, Austin Smotherman. Is that Eric Cole looked a lot better last week. How does he tend to do it this course? So I have really bad news for you, Bart. Last week was the perfect setup for Eric Cole. I tried talking a lot of you guys into playing him last week, if you guys were watching the content. And that's because the Amex is one of the more lenient courses off the tee that we have on tour. It's wide open. Sure, there's some water at the stadium course. That is problematic at times. But the other 2 tracks, La Quinta and the Nicholas course, were literally like cow pastures. You had all the room that you could possibly have needed. This week is the exact opposite of that. This is maybe the most difficult off the tee test of any of the non-majors. The majors, other than Augusta National, are typically a little bit harder than the tests that we're going to have this week. But it's 4.5 inch rough, really narrow driving corridors as well. Eric Cole cannot play those golf courses. And I'm a huge Eric Cole guy. I'll play him as much as humanly possible, but you don't play him at tracks where you get penalized off the tee because he hits the ball crooked and short. And crooked and short at this golf course is a way to get massacred. And I really think the only reason that he's teeing it up this week is because he plays every single week on tour. Like if he was more selective about where he was going, he would not be teeing it up at the Farmers. That's not to say that he can't have a spike week at this sort of golf course. It's just that it's going to be a lot harder for him. He's going to have maybe the best off the tee week of his season at this golf course to finish in the top 10, which is within his range of outcomes. He's going to have a couple events a year where he hits enough fairways to get the job done, but you're relying on somebody that has to have everything go right for them to have any chance of getting to the top 10. And by the way, it's no guarantee that if he just hits the fairways, he gets there. He's also still got to play well on top of that small percentage chance to hit all the fairways. That's why I'd go to other players around them that maybe this sort of golf course don't have to do as much well to get there. That would be my personal preference, at least in that range. Let's go Penge. Yeah, Mr. Marco Polo. As somebody that got suspended for the DP World Tour for betting on golf, I feel like the golf betting community should really like the guy, and I definitely do. How do you join the Patreon? So there's a link in the description of the video, Michael, to go out there and join Golf DFS tiers, how you guys get access to the spreadsheet that you're seeing right now. If you're looking for the props and the bets, that's what the prop and betting tiers for. But there is also a combined tier. If you're doing both, if you're somebody that's DFS and the betting side of things, that's what the combined tiers for. But let me know if you have any questions on top of that, man. But the description should have the link for you. Do I have the longest drivers on Patreon? Sorry for so many questions. You're all good with the questions. That's what this is for. I don't have driving distance on there, but it is for free on the website, PGA Tour website. So, Michael, if you go to pgatour.com, you click stats at the very top. I click off the tee and then just click driving distance. it'll show you all the top drivers for free. So as much as I'd like to sell my Patreon page and say that it has the absolute nuts for everything, it has a lot of stuff that's the nuts that will help you out with your process and make you a much better PGA DFS player. But there's a lot of stuff that you can get for free in golf as well. And I always like to show a lot of people those tools because a lot of times people feel like there's this massive barrier to entry to play something like PGA DFS. It's the exact opposite, actually, with golf. Golf's a very hard sport to learn how to play. DFS-wise, though, it's got the most accessible stats of any of them out there. I've got the PGA Tour website giving you all of that data for free, but also a lot of the databases that you do have to pay for in some cases, but a lot of them will give you the shots gained metrics and a lot of that sort of stuff for free. So check out those kind of resources, and the PGA Tour website is your friend, and you want to make sure to take advantage of it as much as humanly possible. What's going on, Alan? Welcome on in. Cheers to you with my water here. He says, strategy-wise, do I prefer players who are on the south in round one and easier on round two when thinking about the full tournament, or not something that I think about at all? So yeah, I mentioned this earlier, but I don't think it's something that you should really be thinking about at all. It would be different if one of the 2 days was super difficult with the winds. In that scenario, even then, it's not a full-on stacking kind of situation. But what I do whenever there's a lot of winds and one of the 2 golf courses is harder is I try to avoid the hard golf course on the windy day, because it just feels like you could shoot +6 to +8 real quickly if you don't have your game at a hard golf course in hard conditions. Whereas if you're playing the easier golf course, the one that typically plays under par when it's super windy, that you could still probably at least shoot even par on that sort of a day and not shoot yourself out of the golf tournament. So that's how I personally handle these kind of situations. But because there's no massive difference in the weather from day to day, I don't see a big difference in starting one golf course versus the other. So I know some people may say, like, psychologically that it's good to get that round, shoot something like -6, -7. It'll look good for your DFS lineups. You'll be in the top 25 of the GPPs if you're having a lot of guys that are starting on the North course. But if you do it the other way around, you're going to be in dead last place for the first round. So I don't think it's a big part of your process, or at least not a big part of my process. He said there's a 73.5 line on Brooks Koepka. Seems like a trap. What are my thoughts? 73.5 strokes for the under, I would take in a heartbeat. He's at, I think, 72 strokes or like 71.5, something like that on Prize Picks. 73.5, though, even though it is going to be a difficult golf course in his first round back, yeah, +1 or better. I think that's going to be about the field average at the South course. That's a reasonable take, Jose. So yeah, it feels like a trap. I would agree with you on that, man. It feels like they're hanging that there, just knowing that he's not going to have his best stuff. But just from the pure logic standpoint, that makes plenty of sense. Thoughts on a Sam Stevens? So Stevens is a good course fit this week. He hits the ball plenty long enough. He does hit the ball straight when he's playing well as well. And excuse me. Let's take a look at the shots gained metrics, though, so we can really deep dive how he's been doing it. There's an off the tee prowess that I was mentioning. So that makes this a better course fit than most for him. And he's not the best with the short game. And we've seen guys like Luke List. We've seen some other guys, top 5, top 10 here consistently, that are some of the worst putters that we have on the PGA Tour. Stevens is not one of those players. He's a half decent putter when he's in form. Just lately hasn't had his fastball for a lot of that fall swing in here in 2026. So I think he's a good bounce back candidate, somebody that was a top 50 player on tour last year. And he's priced up for the occasion. He's $7,800, but I think that's okay. It's keeping the ownership relatively in check. Any thoughts on Rye and Jordan Smith's plays? So yeah, let's start with Jordan Smith, because he's the one that I actually kind of like out of those two. Not to shit too much on an Aaron Rye, but I'll give you some thoughts here in a second. Jordan Smith, though, ball striking phenom for the DP World Tour. It's the ball long, relatively straight off the tee. Also, at least on the DP World Tour, he was a top 5 iron player. On that side of things, over here, hard to say where he's going to match up. Probably top 50, maybe even top 30 on tour with his approach stats. That should translate really well to this course. The only problem is that he's newer to the PGA Tour. He's adjusting to life over here. It's going to be a big time difference now that they're on the West Coast. And I know he's played a couple events on this West Coast the last couple weeks, but he hasn't had a great start to his 2026 either. So I'll give him a 6 out of 10, 6.5 out of 10. I'm using him in some lineups because he is a 7K range play. 6.5 out of 10 is pretty decent for that portion of the board. Let's talk about Aaron Rye, though. Rye needs to have the week of his life with his accuracy, which he can do. He is one of the most accurate drivers that we have on the PGA Tour. Any of his misses, though, off the tee are going to be penalized like 0.5 to a stroke every single time because he doesn't have the kind of club head speed to get out of that rough and still reach the greens when he's only hitting the ball like 290 off the tee. So that's the problem, Z-Train, is that when he has a bad week, it's going to go really sideways. Like he's going to miss the cut by 4 or 5 strokes when he misses the cut at this event. However, if he has a good ball striking week, these short guys off the tee, like a Snedeker that have won here before, Zach Johnson that has still competed at this event, even when he wasn't very long in his heyday, they get it done when they have those spike weeks. So he's going to be super low owned. That's the other part of it that might actually make it advantageous is because the off the tee narrative is all about distance this week. It's not wrong, by the way. That's the correct narrative, even though it is the predominant narrative around the industry. It is going to make guys like Rye a little bit overlooked, though. So I guess GPPs would be the spot to deploy him. Single entries cash, you're getting too cute on that. Luke, can I deep dive Jake Knapp and Pearson Cootie? So yeah, Jake Knapp, we don't have a lot of stats from because he's taken some time away from golf due to what happened to his girlfriend in the offseason. Understandably so, obviously, that he would, take a couple weeks or even a month to kind of figure out what the heck's going on. My computer's lagging, so if I could type this Control F correctly, we'd get there. But you can see he gains at least over the last 24 rounds. This goes back like 5 months because he hasn't played that much. Like gaining about a stroke per round off the tee. That's exactly what you want at the Farmers Insurance. However, a little putter dependent, not the best with the approach play towards the very end of last season. And I do want to look at the last 12 rounds too. Yeah, same exact profile. Gaining off the tee, gaining with the putter, then losing about a stroke with the approach play. So here's the thing with Knapp. He's a decent course fit. I would have loved him if nobody was using Jake Knapp this week. But as you can see in the ownership that we're about to talk through together, he's actually a little bit higher owned than some of the other guys around him. And I get the off the tee fits there. Everyone's talking about the distance and the accuracy, which he can show us. But the rest of the game is subpar compared to a lot of the other players around him. So I'm going to only have to give him a 5 out of 10 because of that. Like the approach play is something that's a real concern on a Jake Knapp. He said, just stepping in to say, what's up, Luke? What's going on, Mr. R. Klein? He said, have to catch you on playback to actually intake the info. You see Smotherman has a decent finish a few years back. Yeah, so I mentioned the Smotherman thoughts a little bit earlier. So if you're watching this on replay, you'll be able to catch those. But he makes plenty of sense, especially with the kind of ball striking form that he has lately. And he said, if I already covered it, then you're bad. All good, man. Definitely did cover it a little bit earlier, but no issues giving you some extra thoughts there. Let's talk through some ownership at the top. So the highest owned player is going to be a Xander Schauffele at 25.3%. Your highest owned player, also the highest in the official World Golf rankings, or actually I think might even be number 2 behind a Ludwig, but should be number 1 in the official World Golf rankings, is getting a lot of that steam up there. But outside of that, I've got Cam Young at a little bit over that 20% mark, but Cantlay is 19.5%. I still got a Luddy at 18.9% too. So it's pretty spread out, all things considered. And then that next tier down, when you get into this 9K range, it's also pretty spread out here as well. You got a J-Day, a Siwoo Kim that are getting some attention from the masses, but your Spawns, your Hideki Matsuyamas are also over that 16% mark too. So I would say from anyone from Hideki Matsuyama and above, this includes a Xander, who is 25% owned. If you really like them, if you're on them on a Monday, then no concerns whatsoever using any of these players, because it's not just about one piece of chalk making your lineup terrible or that sort of thing. It's not who you play, it's how you play them. And at least for me in my process in building large field GPP lineups, if I'm going to take somebody that's a little bit higher owned than their peers, totally fine doing it with a 9 to 10 or a 10K plus option because they're the best players that we have teeing it up that week. Whereas when we get to the 6 and 7K range and somebody's 3 to 5 times higher roads than somebody that's around them, they're usually not worth it because those 6 and 7K range players are like coin flips to make the cut. And if they're going to be 5 times higher owned than the guy around them, and that guy that's 5 times lower owned has just a pulse, like has any remote chance to be in the optimal lineup, then you want to make that pivot in 99% of cases. So that's that game theory edge that we were mentioning before. That's not to say, though, that up top you want to ignore ownership, because that's not what I'm saying. I am saying, though, that if you have somebody that you want to splurge on the ownership, it's a little bit more okay if it's one of these players that we have pictured. But once we get past Hideki Matsuyama, we start to see a little bit more separation. And guys like Keegan Bradley, a Harris English are significantly lower owned than some of the other guys around them. And this is where, at least in my opinion, you can start to think about making some ownership pivots, because you got the past champion Harris English there. Keegan Bradley, he's played really well at these hard off the tee golf courses in the past. I think major championship setups like a PGA Championship, US Open, that he's had some top 10 and top 20 finishes, even a win at in the past. And then Goddard, I know he's coming in off a win. I know Matt McNeely had a great 2025, but 1.5 to, I think in some contests, it'll be double the ownership for some of these guys compared to a Keegan Bradley and a Harris English. It just doesn't make sense when you compare their hit rates, because, and the reason why I say that in single entry, some other contests, it might be a little bit more extreme, is that in single entries and in some of your higher dollar entries, when people don't have as many bullets to work with, and they also maybe are a little bit more timid, a little bit more skittish when they're playing for higher dollars, a $250 entry hits a little bit differently than just one of your $150 $5 entries that you're entering. When it's that much more at hand for just one lineup, people don't take as many chances. They become a nit, right? If you're familiar with the poker talk, they don't want to go out there and play in any hands, and they won't use guys like a Harris English or Keegan Bradley there. And you'll see them, especially with their 9, 10K players, only using the obvious options that everyone else is landing on. So if you're in one of those kind of contests and you want to try and find a way to get some leverage on a week like this, and if you want to do it up top, it's these sort of players that can do it for you. So that's where the ownership comes in. It's maybe not as important as it is towards the bottom, but if you start to make some of these decisions, it opens up more flexibility in that 7K range. And let's say that there is a 7K range player that you want to use that's closer to 10% owned. Well, the way to make that work, like I said, it's not who you play, it's how you go out there and play your lineup that matters. Making one of these decisions up top can open up the flexibility to maybe splurge on somebody down low. But I would say just because you're making one of these decisions up top and getting that differentiation doesn't mean that you have to take a piece of chalk down low. And especially if you're in a large field 150 max contest against a whole bunch of other entries, it's totally fine to go leverage across the board if you want to. If you really want to play against the rest of the field, golf is one of the few sports where you don't have to completely adhere to the projections, especially in large field contests. When we go down to the 8K range, ownership's also pretty spread out. The last couple times we went through ownership up top, this 8K range was a little bit more condensed, but we've got guys like Ryan Gerard, who I still like. For in large field GPP lineups, he's the big piece of chalk at about 18%. But we've got players like an Alex Noren that are less than half the ownership of a Ryan Gerard. And of course, the hit rates, the optimal percentage, at least the top 5, top 10 rate of guys like a Noren compared to a Gerard are not double from player to player. In fact, it's probably like at most 1.5x from a Noren up to a Gerard. So that ownership, that inflated ownership that we're getting on a Ryan here is not worth it. You would say that, but again, it's not who you play. It's not who you play. It's how you play them in your lineup. So if you use a Ryan Gerard, you just make sure you're getting different elsewhere, especially because he's in that 8K range. These are some of the better players that we have in the field. But players like Alex Noren, you can see Brooks Koepka is only 7.2%. But even these players closer to 10%, like Will Zalatoris. By the way, he was the mega chalk of all mega chalk last year before withdrawing. But a Max Homa and Adam Scott as well are a little bit lower owned than some of these other guys. And if you start to make that kind of ownership pivot from rather than going with the Gerard and going to pretty much anyone else, I guess a Knapp too, getting a little bit of steam. But other than a Gerard and Knapp, you're going to have slightly more flexibility in that 6 and that 7K range. So though the ownership is going to be cut off at this 8K mark, I do have to keep some of that behind the paywall for my members over there on my Patreon page. If you guys want to find the rest of it, you guys can find that on the Patreon version. But just know that this 7K range chalk is arguably even more important than what we have up top. In fact, I actually want to bring up the spreadsheet real quickly on the side. And although I'm not going to show you guys the exact projections for that 7K range, I'm going to point out a few of the players that are getting the steam. Maybe not the exact numbers on each player, but a few players that will be higher owned than the rest of the field. Let's see. So Sam Stevens I have as the chalk at the top end of the 7K range. He's the highest owned out of all of them. Michael Thorbjornsen getting some steam. I'd say Erasmus Højgaard as well. He's over 12% owned, so I guess that would be notable there. But Sam Stevens is the chalkiest of the bunch. Middle end of the 7K range, the chalkiest players are Pearson Coody. A Nikolai Højgaard at $7,500 is a close second with the chalk at that portion. And then the bottom end of the 7K range, the ownership drops off quite a bit. There's not really anyone that's really over that 10% mark. But a Patrick Rogers, he's still got the good form. Last week, I thought it was a slightly better course fit, but I could still totally use him here. It's another West Coast golf course off the tee fit. And then in the 6K range, your chalk is like a pot guider. That's like 2.7% owned. David Ford is 2% owned. And even then, like 2% owned chalk at the bottom is not great, right? It's 2% owned as opposed to guys that are 0.5 to 1% owned around them. But it's not unusable. You have somebody that's down there that's 2%, just have a sub 5%er in the 7K range, and you're probably going to be all right. But those are a few names to keep an eye on. And then you guys obviously saw all those players that we had from 8K plus. Up top, the ownership matters, but down low with some of those names that we just mentioned, it's even more important to keep it in mind, because if you have any of those 6 and 7K pieces of chalk and players up here that are close to 20%, then you're running out of spots to get that differentiation in there. So that's the ownership angle. That's the game theory angle. Again, guys, to download this sheet with everything that I have for this week, make sure to check out the Patreon page for that. But now let's put a lineup together and then go over the prop and betting side. We have only got about 10 minutes left of the live stream, so I've got to get this thing moving. Any last second questions, feel free to go ahead and throw those in chat. But we talked a lot about this game theory side already, and it's just making sure that you're balancing your chalk in your low-owned pieces. The large field GPPs, you want at least 2, maybe even 3 pivots in every single lineup. And let's say that you're a little bit chalkier towards the top. You threw in, let's go with the Xander. Obviously, I really like him this week. I really like a lot of Hideki Matsuyama as well. Down to the 8K range, let's throw in a Homa, who I really like, but he's about average ownership for that range. We've got 3 players in here that are average to above average ownership, but it's at the top end of the board, so that's okay. Now we're down to our 3 spots where we need those pivots. And because it's a large field GPP, 2 to 3 pivots should be what you're looking for. And I say 2 to 3 because if it's 2 guys that are sub 3% owned, then that's okay. But if it's 3 guys that are sub 7% owned, then that's also probably okay. But you can see we're down to $7,300 remaining, and that puts us into that 7K range. And that's why I say it's so important to have pivots on this portion of the board, because if you're taking chalk down here, then you're really scrapping, you're scrapped for spots to try and get that leverage in there. So let's go ahead and try to make a slate ownership pivot on a Brooks Koepka as opposed to somebody that's closer to 12 to 15% around him in the 7K range, rather than taking a piece of chalk towards the bottom. Let's go with Chris Wright-Tan for a little bit of a bounce back. And then now that we're down to the 6K range, there's not really anyone down here that's going to be overly high owned. So you're probably okay regardless of who you take. But as long as you're not taking somebody that's that 2 to 3%er down here, you're 100% going to be unique no matter what kind of contest that you're entering, and you're going to have the kind of leverage that you're hoping for as well. So, and that's even with a chalkier start. Let's say that you made one of those pivots that I was mentioning with like a Harris English or Keegan Bradley at $9,200. In this sort of case, let's say that there was a chalky guy at $6,700. There's not. None of these guys that are over that 3% mark. But let's say that somebody at $6,700 was like 10% owned. Because we made that ownership pivot, going for somebody that was like 16% owned down to a 9 to 10%er on Keegan Bradley, you might be able to get away with that sort of 10%er at $6,700. Now, do you have to take that guy who's chalkier down low just because he made that pivot? No, but you at least have a better chance of pulling that off because of it. So that's what I want you guys to take away from this lineup construction segment, is that it is about that balancing act depending on the contest you're entering. The rule of thumb to live by: the larger the field contest you're entering, the more leverage that you need. That means that the smaller field contests, so like single entries, for example, you need a little bit less leverage. So maybe rather than 2 to 3 pivots in every single lineup, it's 1 to 2 pivots that you need in that sort of lineup construction. But that's what I've got on the DFS side. But now let's look at some props. And for the year, we're about 12 units into the positive so far. That's part of the reason that I'm going to the butcher to pick up a nice piece of steak in about 7 to 10 minutes here. But let's see if we can add some more units to the bankroll and maybe get some A5 Wagyu next week. It's a nice piece of meat that we have with the 2 bone-in ribeyes that I'm picking up. But A5 Wagyu is just another level, and another level with the price tag too. So that's why we've got to add some units to the bankroll before we do that. But course conditions, at least weather-wise, are going to be ideal for the first couple of days. Thursday in particular, if we go to this HRRR, which is our go-to, it looks sub 10 miles an hour the entire day. So these averages from last year are not going to be the best, just because the scoring should be a little bit easier. So if we go to the round props tab on Bet the Number, we can go to some of the averages over the last 10 seasons and see what the field averages were. And even though last year was harder because we had nasty weather for 2 of the 4 rounds, The year before that was a lot more traditional, and it wasn't that much easier. Like the birdie average was still only 3.17 per round. Bogey or worse average was still over 3.15 per round at 3.19 there. You can see the fairway average did go up a bit, but it's not like you were going from a 7 to an 8.5 average or something. And the green average was only 10.47 per round last year, but it's historically less than 12 anyways. And there's even some other years out there where it was sub 11 as well. So this is a golf course that, regardless of the weather that these guys are playing in, is going to be one of the hardest that they have on the entire schedule. So going back to these averages, I think the scoring average is going to be closer to +1, so probably about 2/3 of a stroke easier. Birdie average close to like 3.15 to 3.25 per round. Bogey or worse average, I think, will drop to closer to like 3.25 per round. But even though I do think that some of these averages will improve, and by the way, bogey or worse average, probably like 3.5 per round. 3.25 is probably a little bit too optimistic. They're not drastic changes, though. That's just because Torrey Pines, no matter, like I said, regardless of what weather you're playing in, is a major championship sort of venue. So fairway average, I think 7.5 would be a good working average to use. And then for greens regulation, I think this one's a little bit harder, but I'd say like 11, maybe like 11.25 per round for the field average. But on the North Course side, now this is where it's going to be a big change compared to last year. The North Course played 0.72 over par, and that's because you not only had the hard conditions for the first couple of days, but you also had the guys that were the lower tier guys before the cut line on that golf course. So a lot of your really high rounds, like +8 to +10, were throwing off this average. Most of the years at this golf course, at the North Course, it plays under par. There's like a year that played -1.76, -1.85, but there are years where it played -2.56, and then a year where it played -3.3 for a couple rounds. So this is a golf course that is at least 3 strokes easier than the South Course under calm conditions. And I think for tomorrow, that's what we're going to see. So if I think it's going to play to like +1, maybe like +0.5, the South Course, if it plays a little bit easier, I think the North Course is going to play -2 to -2.5. So it's a pretty drastic change from venue to venue. And because on sites like Prize Picks, if we're going to try and get a 3x payout, we want overs and unders or positive and negative stance plays mixed in together. It's kind of useful to have the situation where one golf course is a brute and one is going to be a little bit easier, so we can go out there and enter those kind of slips. So that's what I've done. That's what we're going to see with the piece of exposure that I get to here in a second. I'll throw out some of the DP World Tour stuff. We're not going to go over any props here together on that side, as it locks in 4 hours, and a lot of people watching this on replay are not going to be able to catch those before it goes live. But the average was -0.74. The birdie average was 3.77 per round. Bogey or worse average, 2.83 per round. And the weather, I will show you that super quickly on here, looks pretty windy for the first round. And the ECM isn't really the best to look at. We'll look at the GFS, which is a little bit more accurate. And it looks like it's going to be over 10 miles an hour sustained, close to 25 miles an hour of wind gusts in the afternoon. So based on the board, and I'm just going to give you my general thoughts on it, there's a lot of fade value, in my opinion, for the DP World Tour side. In fact, on my Patreon page on the golf and prop and betting tier, I've already entered a slip. That's a combination between the PGA side and the DP World Tour side. And using fades from both of them still gives us the full 3x payout, because it's 2 different events that we're mixing in together. So no correlation when you have 2 events that aren't even being played at the same place. So it's not like we're correlating it or anything, but we are able to find line value from both sides and still pay them for a respectable payout. And the reason why it's so important to try and get that 3x if we can is that if we do correlate, let's say like 2 overs on strokes at the South Course, they're giving you 2.5 to 2.6x on a site like Prize Picks, which is an absolute scam. That 2.5, 2.6x, by the way, includes your money being given back to you. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that are maybe new to those websites, that it's essentially like getting a +150 to +160 parlay on those 2. And if you're running parlays on sites like Draftkings and Fanduel with quote unquote 50-50 odds like you have on these, you would know that +150 to +160 on a 2-leg parlay, even if it is correlated, is absolute horseshit from the payout perspective. So that's why we have to find some of these creative ways to get to our exposure so that we're not being absolutely scammed from the payout perspective. So here's a slip that we're going to take from round number 1 for the rest of the exposure that I'm playing for Underdog, Prize Picks, Hard Rock Bet, Better, Sleeper, all those different sites that you guys can bet golf props on. You guys can find that on the Patreon, but this will be the community detail for tomorrow. So it's going to be a Garrett Higo under on strokes. He's playing the easier North Course. And then it's a Mackenzie Hughes under on birdies. And we're going to start with the Garrett Higo one. So I think the scoring average, and maybe this is a bit bullish, we'll see, -2 to -2.5 scoring average. Let's say that I am being bullish, and let's actually be more conservative about it here. And let's say that it's like a -1 to -2 scoring average. Actually, let's go -1.5 to -2 to kind of condense it a little bit. If that's going to be the case, this is still massive value for Garrett Higgo, because if you take a look at the last 6 months on the PGA Tour, Garrett Higgo is the number 4 player in this field. And although the odds, the DraftKings pricing aren't necessarily giving him that respect, by the way, I think that's a massive mistake. Like, it's half the reason I think Garrett Higgo is such a great play this week. He's the number 4 player in form over the last 6 months, and you're telling me that he's at or maybe 0.5 strokes better than the field average. That is just a massive, massive mistake. In fact, the guys that he's better than with the form perspective are a lot of cases at 69 strokes or 69.5 strokes at the very worst. Like guys like an Adam Scott, he blows away with the form, and he's at like 69.5 strokes. Wyndham Clark, I mean, I know Wyndham Clark's won a major and whatnot, but Garrett Higgo has been a much, much better and much more consistent player on the PGA Tour over the last year or so. And Wyndham Clark's at 69 strokes. So in my opinion, it makes no sense to have guys like Higgo at 70 strokes, as he's the same, if not a better player than all of those other guys. And we're getting the push equity at -2. So let's say with my conservative -1.5, he has to gain a half a stroke to the field to push that sort of number. Given that he was averaging 1.94 shots gained per round over the last 6 months, that is well within his range of outcomes. But let's take away the conservative mandate. Let's say it does play -2 to -2.5. Like I think an average day pushes that sort of a line, and then gaining 0.5 strokes to a 2.5 under par scoring average actually has him hitting that sort of a line. And of course, 0.5 strokes gained to the field is a lot less than his 1.94 shots gained baseline. So he's at 69.5 on the books. He is juiced a little bit towards the over, but I don't agree with their pricing for the North Course. It's like they're looking at these averages from last year and not normalizing them based on the conditions, which were horse shit for the first couple of days. I mean, the North Course never plays over par. So this 0.72 strokes over par average that we had from last year is just exceptionally rare at that golf course. And if you go back to any of the years prior to that, you'll see that it was a much different kind of situation. So I don't think the books have properly encapsulated that. And even then, he's at 69.5 at the books. Even with them not getting it right, this is still line value in comparison, which is why it was the first prop that I went out there and wanted to enter. And then we've got the other side, which is at the harder golf course, and Mackenzie Hughes under on birdies. And last year, Mackenzie Hughes ranked 171 on the PGA Tour in birdie or better percentage, was literally 9th from last in birdie or better percentage. And all the other guys down there from like 171 to 180 were guys that aren't even playing on the PGA Tour this year. Dog shit, right? Pretty much retired in most cases down there. Mackenzie had a horrendous season, and if you take a look at his form at this golf course, he's missed the cut more than he's made the cut here, and he has one top 30 finish. So he just doesn't have a great track record around Torrey Pines. He had the one decent start, decent time in contention when it was at a major championship, but the Farmers Insurance Open has really had his numbers, and at 3.5 birdies, I mean, let's just go back to the average from last year. It was 2.81 per round. I do think it's going to go up a bit, probably to like 3.15 to 3.25. We haven't looked at the pin locations yet. They weren't out before we got on the live stream here. But even let's say it's the easiest pin setup they've ever done for the Farmers, I don't see it getting higher than like a 3.5 birdie average. And let's say that like worst case scenario, we're working with like a 3.5 field birdie average. He was number 171 on tour last year. There were only 9 players worse than him. Of the guys that actually have playing status this year, this is non-exaggeration, by the way, there is no one worse than Mackenzie Hughes at making birdies that has status in 2026. If the average is going to be 3.5, obviously the worst player in that category is going to be somebody that we're taking towards the under. And he doesn't have an exact line to compare to on the books, but there are a lot of better players on the board, guys that are actually above average birdie makers at 3.5, that on that course, again, the harder South course, are juiced towards the under. So make it make sense. How the hell is quite literally the worst player in the field in the category at that 3.5 number when better players, guys that are above average, are favored to go under that sort of projection? So massive, massive value there. Again, we don't have the line comparison, but it would be like -200 towards the under if we had a line. At least that's what I would put it at if I was DraftKings. And then this Garrett Higgo one here, if I was setting the line on DraftKings, he would be 69.5 and he'd be like minus 150 towards the under. So that's why they were both no-brainer plays. They are slightly anti-correlated, but they're playing at different golf courses. So that's why the anti-correlation isn't as impactful there. So 3x payout, in my opinion, was worth playing, and not the only piece of exposure that was taken for round one. The rest of that you guys can find on the Patreon, though. And then I am going to put out a head-to-head for round one as well, and that's going to be this Lee Hodges at minus 115 versus Austin Eckroat. And respect to both of these guys, Lee Hodges, one of the most underrated players over the last 4 months. That's why we're taking that side of things. But even Eckroat's been okay. Eckroat's a good ball striker. I think he's a decent course fit for this kind of a week. But let me show you why I think that this is massive value. So let me get a sip of water there. My mouth's getting a little dry as I bring up both of these players on the Bet the Number matchup tool. So both playing solid golf. In fact, for DFS purposes, I like both of them this week. Both of them in my player pool and I think are usable in large field GPPs. Lee Hodges, by the way, not getting any ownership, despite, look at that form, 1.39 shots gained total per round, but it's a 1.04 shots gained per round difference between these two. And Austin Eckroat, he's missed the cut in 3 of his 4 starts here. I think his best finish was like a T29 the one time he made the cut. Lee Hodges, on the other hand, finished T9 at this golf course last year. So at minus 110, with the better course history, the better shots gained for him heading in, and it's not even just over that sample size, but if we extend this out to, let's say, the last 48 is probably as far as we'd want to take it. But even then, Lee Hodges is about 0.38 shots gained better per round. Minus 115 is just not enough juice, in my opinion. In fact, I would have this price closer to minus 140 myself. So at that minus 115 number, I thought it was worth playing. And although they didn't have an exact line on these two on some of the other major books, the 3-ball odds with Lee Hodges, Eckroat, I forget who the third player was. The third player was the big long shot at like plus 250 odds. But Lee Hodges was the clear favorite in that 3-ball. He was about 20 to 25 points better on the odds at sites like Draftkings and Fanduel. So the fact that these are both minus 115, Lee Hodges, Eckroat, if you wanted to take that side, he's minus 115 towards the other. It's just a clear inefficiency with the price tag. And these head-to-heads, this is the one without a tie, by the way. This is the tie no bet market, have been our big money maker on Hard Rock Bet because the all the time, like consistently are mispricing these compared to a lot of the other major books. And it's not like I'm only just plus EV betting these. I'm going out there from the traditional analysis perspective, using the matchup tool, a lot of these head-to-heads like we had here between Lee Hodges and Eckroat. But if I can find something like this, where it's like, especially that last 24 round sample, that's my main go-to on a lot of these. It's like over a stroke difference between the two, and the odds are favorable towards that player. It's kind of like with this Prize Picks thing over here, where we're looking for value and something that makes sense from the traditional analysis perspective. It's harder to find bets like this. It takes me a long time to find this value. I feel like there's some people that probably think that it takes me like 30 seconds to find these bets. Quite literally, it takes hours and hours to find these bets, but it's because I'm so selective about what we're playing so that it doesn't just make sense from 1 or 2 different angles. It makes sense from 3, 4, even 5 angles if we can possibly make that happen. And that's where you can really make the difference with your long-term ROI. A lot of people think it's done with volume, just entering a whole bunch of bets. You can do it that way if you're doing something lazily or even automated. The other way to do it, though, is with quality, is to really have a lot of control over your plays, only enter the ones that you feel a lot of conviction behind. And that's my personal strategy. That's why it's a lot of 2-mans that you see on my content. And with a lot of the bets that I'm entering, a lot of just single bets for these head-to-heads that's just what works best for me. It's what I've had a lot of success with the last 6 or 7 years. I'm professional. I'm limited on all the major books because of the kind of success that we found. But as you've seen with our results over just a couple weeks to start this year, we're already up nearly 12 units over just a couple weeks. So that slow, proven formula, every single round, grinding it out on these sites, trying to add to the bankroll, over time, it adds up. And if you're willing to put in the time, put in the effort to find that sort of a value, by the time you get to the end of the season, it's like plus 75 to plus 150 units at times that you find on my Patreon page. So if you want to tail all of that exposure, you can find that on the Patreon. Like I was saying before, that's not only all the Prize Picks and Underdog stuff, but also anything I'm entering on the sports books. That includes head-to-heads, top 10s, top 20s, also my entire outright betting card. And I did go over 4 outright bets on my video that I did on Monday, but I do have 9 outright bets that I've added to the card this week. So if you guys want to catch all of those, you guys can find that on the Patreon page as well. But I promised my butcher I would try and get there before 8. I'm running a little bit behind here at 7:48. I'm going to go over any last second questions that you guys have for me in the chat. But that's all I've got for this 2026 Farmers. I hope to see you guys at the top end of the GPPs. Smash that like button if you guys haven't already. Also subscribe to the channel if you guys haven't already too, so you guys don't miss any of the content to come. And for rounds 2 through 4, we're going to have showdown live streams and prop live streams, getting you ready for all of that exposure after play ends over the next couple of days. So if you're subscribed, you get notified when I go live with all of that. Let me see if there's any last second questions, and let's have ourselves a week. Yeah, it looks like we've got some questions. So if I skip any, I'm sorry, but I do, like I said, literally have to go. I promised them I'd be there before 8. It is close though. You went with, let's see. You went with Homa for your one and done. What are my thoughts on that? So I think it's a decent spot for it. It's not a signature event, so you don't have to have a stud for your one and done this week. And Homa past win at this course, a couple other top 15, top 20 finishes on top of that. I bet him outright. So I'm not going to give you any pushback or any concern with that. I think it's a pretty solid play. And from the strategy perspective, it checks out too. What's going on? Mahalo, Luke. Let's build that stack. Amen. Am I able to trust Willie Z after last week? You said you'd be 100% on him pre-injury. Yeah, I tried to bet him last year before he withdrew, and I ended up having to get my money back. I can't say I trust him, though. Like, trust for me is a volatile thing. I have a hard time doing that with golfers that aren't named Scotty Scheffler. So I wouldn't say that I can 100% trust him. But last week was a very good sign for Will Zalatoris. So I'm okay deploying him in DFS, especially because he's not super high owned. But I wouldn't be like rock solid on him. Like it could go sideways. It's a course with a lot of rough, and the back injuries, the things that he's been dealing with, a lot of times those are problematic for people with back injuries. What's going on? ZK Ring. He says, Luke, getting back into PGA DFS. Just had to return to the channel. Nice to have you back. He said he just resubbed to the Patreon, which is also great to hear. And yeah, amen to that. Let me know if you have any questions over there on the Patreon page. I'll get back to you after I get to this butcher in a few minutes. He said, what's up, Luke? 2 guys you're interested in. One's a vibe play. One seems like a decent course fit. You got Brooksy for the vibes, and then you got Adam Scott for the course fit. Yeah, Scott does fit these harder tracks like a Genesis. He's torn up. Major championships. He's top 10, top 20 machine. So I think you're right about the course fit on Adam Scott. The vibes thing on Brooksy, though, I don't know if I can get behind it. I love Brooks. I'm using him in some GPP lineups, but I fully expect him to miss the cut. He was horrible on Live before he came over. He hasn't played like any time recently. It's a hard golf course. You normally don't find your game at Torrey. I hope I'm wrong because I'm using him in a few lineups just in case. But yeah, I think he's probably missing the cut, if I'm going to be honest. You always take the lower owned toy guard. That's a pretty good role to live by. They're both volatile. They both make a whole bunch of birdies. So I'm using both this week. Why not both is the way I'm going with it. Thanks, Luke. Any thoughts on Carl Phillips as a value play? He's a good driver of the golf ball. He did have his one win at a Birdie Fest, though. So I feel a little bit more comfortable at those sort of golf courses. But he's essentially unowned. I mean, you're sub 1% in the 6K range. So if you're telling me you're throwing him in like 3 to 5 lineups as a flyer in GPPs, then I'm not going to give you too much pushback on that. You said, great work. Appreciate that, man. You can't super chat. You should be able to. If not, buy me a beer if I come out to Cali, I guess. You can handle it that way. And I'll look into that because you should be able to. And I haven't had a super chat in a couple months, and I was wondering why. And maybe it's because it's not letting you guys do it. That would explain a lot. But either way, cheers. And I don't think I'm coming out to Cali this year, Yob. But if I ever see you, I'll buy you a beer and maybe we can exchange a beer on that. Thoughts on Gerard for one and done this week? I think it's a decent week for Gerard and one and done too. I know we had a Homa question before on whether that one made sense. Gerard feels like the safer play. So if you've had a couple really good weeks, Kathleen, then I think Gerard, especially with his top 10, top 20 percentage, would make a lot of sense if you're playing from ahead. It's maybe too early to start making a lot of those kind of decisions, but he's the safe play. Like, he's not the kind of guy that I think is going to win this event per se, but I do have a top 10 bet on Ryan Gerard at this event. So yeah, it depends on how you started. If you've started really well, then I really like a Ryan Gerard. If you've started terribly, let's say you have like $0 through the first couple weeks, then I would probably rather go with a Homa over a Gerard just because I think the upside's higher on a Max Homa. You said you should ask a question. Are you crazy for going back to Thorne and Aubert? You're not. And I think especially in Aubert, this is a golf course that he's won at before. It wasn't this event. He had ended up winning it at the Genesis last year. And course conditions are going to be a lot more like when he won at the Genesis than what they were at the actual Farmers in 2025. So not crazy. And I think you're talking about Michael Thorbjornsen. Maybe you're talking about Thorbjorn Olesen. Either one, actually, pretty decent course fits this week. And yeah, I'd say like 6.5, 7 out of 10 on both of those. But that's all I've got, guys. I appreciate your support in the channel. As I was saying there before, I got to head out to the butcher. But best of luck with everything that you guys are going with. Rounds 2 through 4, we'll be back with those live streams. So stay tuned for all of that. And check out the Patreon page for all the content, as I was saying before. But that's all, guys. Best of luck, and I'll see you guys tomorrow night.